So for those of you that don't know, obviously I've been reading a lot of his stuff lately, and I think that he's had a pretty decent influence on how I would view a lot of topics economically. Things like socialism and structures thereof, and sovereign wealth funds certainly, and welfare policy and things like that. I just think overall Matt Bruenig is a pretty good writer and a pretty decent analyzer of economic issues and data. Now, I don't agree with everything. I think, for instance, I released a more sort of critical video of one of the papers he released about childhood poverty going down, and I feel like he kind of missed the mark on that one. But I think overall, pretty good writer. Obviously socialist, and I believe also pretty much just economic socialist, and he has the People's Policy Project. Had a pretty good interview with him on my channel, interview/debate, where we kind of talked about all these things. And one thing that I was curious about was, one of his big advocacy points about socialism is establishments of various sovereign wealth funds. And my thought was, what is his actual model? And I think that when we talked about it on our discussion on my channel, he talked about basically having competing public sovereign wealth funds to ensure sort of capital efficiency and things like that. But that kind of thought popped into my head again. I was like, I wonder what his exact model is. And I kind of just looked it up, and it turns out he's released this paper called A Social Wealth Fund for America. And of course, by Matt Bruenig, sponsored by his own company, the People's Policy Project. And I think if we go big screen here, it's weird because I can't see this graphic, but I think this graphic kind of illustrates, we could actually see the whole thing, what his model is. But nonetheless, we're going to go over it. And it's very long though, so if I don't get it done this video, I'll just do it at another point and then combine the two and release it in one go. But I thought this would be an interesting model to delve through, to analyze, because I think sovereign wealth funds are a good idea, and I'd be interested to see what Matt Bruenig's model is for social ownership of capital and things like that. So let's read about it and let's get going. So People's Policy Project is a think tank founded in 2017. The primary mission of 3P is to publish ideas and analysis that assist in the development of an economic system that serve the many, not the few. Matt Bruenig is the founder of the People's Policy Project. Contents: introduction, background on social wealth funds. 2, the Alaska Permanent Fund. 3, the American Solidarity Fund, which is essentially the model he's going to recommend. Got conclusions, end notes, and then call a fund. I'm not sure what that means, but this is essentially a pamphlet as well. You can download this for free, if I'm not mistaken, and kind of grab it here. 62 pages overall, but it's kind of his own pamphlet he's released on his model. So, introduction. In the United States, the top 1% of family owns more wealth than the bottom 95% of families combined. Millionaires own 80% of the country's wealth, while the bottom third of families owns none of it. Between 2007 and 2016, the average wealth of the top 1% increased by 4.9 million, at the same time as the wealth of the median family declined by 42,000. Much has been written in recent years about the worsening of wealth inequality in America. This is an important story, but it can also mislead readers into thinking that mid-century America was an egalitarian society. It was not. In 1962, the bottom 40% of families owned just 0.3% of the national wealth, while the top 1% of families owned 33% of the national wealth. Today, those figures are negative 0.5% and 40% respectively. Then, as now, the country was home to a large propertyless underclass and high levels of overall inequality. Wealth levels vary considerably by race, age, and education, but these intergroup differences are not why overall wealth inequality is so high. This can be demonstrated by looking at the distribution of wealth within each demographic group. White, black, Latino, less than high school, some college, 10 to 30, or 18 to 35, 35 to 50, 51 to 65. And I suppose this is the amount of wealth the top 1% owns, and certainly pretty much all of these demographics face similar levels of inequality within each demographic sector. Or, I'm sorry, percent of wealth owned by the top 10% of each demographic group. So amongst the 65-year-olds, 70% of the wealth is owned by the top 10%. Amongst the 18 to 35-year-olds, more than 80% is owned by the top 10%. Amongst Latino population, almost 80% of the wealth is owned by the top 10% of Latinos. So in virtually every demographic group, wealth distribution takes on the same familiar pattern. The top 10% owns around 3/4 of the group's wealth, while the bottom third owns none of it. Why wealth in capitalist societies tends to concentrate like this has been a matter of much discussion over the years. Broadly speaking, it appears that capitalist economies contain feedback loops that cause relatively minor differences in initial endowments or incomes to be amplified over time. Those with more wealth receive more income, those with more income save at higher rates, and those who save at higher rates accumulate a larger share of national wealth. In other words, wealth begets wealth. Now, I do hope that he kind of explains perhaps some of the problems empirically with wealth inequality. I mean, certainly a lot of people would look at this and just say, well, why is it necessarily a given that wealth inequality is bad, right? And I hope he explains that at least to some degree in this pamphlet here. In this paper, I propose that the U.S. government tackle the problem of wealth inequality by creating a social wealth fund, SWF, and issuing one share of ownership in the fund to every American. After the fund is created, the government will gradually accumulate assets for the fund to manage, such as stocks, bonds, and real estate. As the assets under management increase, the value of the shares held by the citizen owners will increase, causing wealth inequality to fall. Although the citizen owners will not be permitted to sell their shares, they will be paid a universal basic dividend, a UBD, each year from the investment income earned by the fund. I think when he says each year, I don't think he means literally one annual payment. At least I hope that's not what he would mean. I mean, at the very least, you'd want a dividend to be paid quarterly, to have some regularity in income flow, but we'll see if he gets into that detail in the future. Section 1 of the paper provides a basic background on social wealth funds. Section 2 discusses the Alaska Permanent Fund, a social wealth fund created by the state of Alaska in 1976. And Section 3 contains a detailed proposal that federal policymakers could use to create an American social wealth fund along the lines explained above. Our current policy discussion around wealth inequality is inadequate for the task at hand. This discussion features mostly small bore proposals, often going under the head of low-income asset building, that, if implemented, would have virtually no effect on the overall level of wealth inequality in the country. The goal of this paper is to go beyond these conventional proposals and provide a solution to wealth concentration that is designed to confront the monumental scale of the problem we face. Background on social wealth funds. Social wealth funds are generally defined as, quote, collectively held financial funds, fully owned by the public and used for the benefit of society as a whole. The concept is also sometimes referred to as citizens' wealth funds or sovereign wealth funds. Whatever you call it, the idea is simple. The government directly owns a large pool of income-generating assets and then uses the return on those assets for social welfare purposes. Interest in social wealth funds has spiked in recent years. Seth Ackerman proposed the creation of such a fund in 2012. Peter Barnes published a book on the subject in 2014. Tony Atkinson proposed the idea as a solution to inequality in his 2015 book. Angela Camus and Stuart Lansley put out books about it in 2016. Former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis wrote in support of the idea in 2016. The Pan-European movement, DIEM 25, included this idea in the European New Deal platform in 2017, and 2 British think tanks published reports promoting the idea in 2018. In addition to interest from policy writers, Hillary Clinton endorsed the concept of creating a national sovereign wealth fund in her 2017 campaign memoir. The recent burst of writings on this topic was predated by a century of similar proposals. Rudolf Hilferding argued that the socialization of financial assets, quote, constitutes the ultimate phase of the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat in 1910. Oscar Lange argued for the payment of a social dividend out of a collectively owned capital stock in 1936. Nobel Prize-winning economist James Mead published a paper in favor of the idea in 1964, and John Romer published something similar to a social wealth fund in 1994, his book, I Should Say. The older sovereign wealth fund advocates were typically motivated by market socialist ideologies. To them, a social wealth fund provided a way for society to collectively own, control, and benefit from the wealth of the nation. Although some modern sovereign wealth fund advocates continue to argue for the idea on these traditional terms, most choose instead to present it as a practical and egalitarian source of revenue for social welfare purposes. The turn towards the practical has likely been driven by the fact that the sovereign wealth fund idea has now been successfully implemented many times throughout the world. At the beginning of 2016, the globe was home to around 80 sovereign wealth funds spread across more than 60 governments, with most of the funds being established after the year 2000. Not all of these funds exist for a social purpose, and some do not meet all the definition of a social wealth fund used above, but they all nonetheless prove that a government can own and manage large pools of income-generating assets without significant problems. So I think the one thing that I would add to this so far is that when we think of sovereign wealth funds as essentially publicly managed investment funds, there's really a shitload more than 80, right? Every university virtually in the whole like country, in most countries in the world, I think public universities have endowments, right? Endowments are investment, like pools of assets managed by universities that generate return for public purposes, right? In this case, a public education, right? Different pension systems, right? When the New York Fire, department invests money into the market in order to generate return to support retirees, that's a publicly managed pool of assets that goes to support a public service like firefighters, right? That's a sort of public industry. And so, pension funds, endowments, city level experiments with the same exact thing. There's many more examples of publicly managed investment funds in the world than just the sort of national level sovereign wealth funds. So, let's see. Yo, man, if you don't mind me asking, what do you say to leftists who say capitalism and taking care of the environment is mutually exclusive? Well, it depends on what they mean by capitalism, right? So obviously the profit motive can be not compatible with taking care of the environment, right? But in general, markets and the profit motive should just be regulated in such a way that you get efficient allocation of resources, but also doesn't destroy the environment, right? So that comes with regulation, taxation, things like that. I mean, if you look at the large time span of environmental regulation and different incentive management over time, we've become a significantly more environmentally friendly over time, especially in the last decade or two, than we were at the turn of the century in the 1900s. So I should say. So let's see. Any chance we could look at the Philippine Sovereign Wealth Fund after this? That was marred by controversy. I honestly am not very sure about the Philippines Sovereign Wealth Fund, but yeah, link me either on Twitter or on Discord. Feel free to link me any reading that you want on that. So. Ethan Bishop, not much can say if there's a stated position. It's obviously not true. I guess we have some esoteric debate on why I think taking care of the environment asks them are saying. Man, Dionysus, I'm having a hard time understanding that. Apple Islander, would the sovereign wealth fund assets even be counted towards measurements of household wealth? The government assets already directly support society's poorest, but that's not included in wealth equity statistics. Well, I mean, I think that in this regard, he's not talking about just the government having a pool of assets that it dedicates towards sort of transfer programs like welfare. I think what he's talking about is actual capital income being distributed to people, right? So that's structurally a pretty big difference than like welfare. Although certainly there are socialists who think that like welfare statism is an example of socialism, but I don't think most people agree with that. So, all right. The turn towards the practical has likely been driven. Oh yeah, sorry, I already read this. Yeah, essentially there's a lot more examples of sovereign wealth funds than just these sort of national levels sovereign wealth funds. So Sweden's failure. Okay, interesting. We might be learning about a failure of a sovereign wealth fund. The most famous social wealth fund in history was the one briefly established in Sweden in the 1980s. The Swedish wage earner funds, as they were called, were the brainchild of trade union economists Rudolf Meidner and Gösta Rehn. Meidner published a book on the idea in 1978 titled Employee Investment Funds, An Approach to Collective Capital Formation, and then a retrospective paper in 93 titled Why Did the Swedish Model Fail? The Meidner Plan, as it came to be known, proposed using a script tax to gradually transfer ownership of Sweden's corporations away from private shareholders and into wage earner funds administered by the country's labor unions. Under the plan, Swedish companies would be required to essentially pay a 20% tax on their profits, but rather than paying the tax in cash, they would instead issue an equivalent amount of new stock to the relevant wage earner fund. Meidner calculated that with an average profit margin of 15% and a continual reinvestment of profits back into buying more shares, the wage earner funds would have majority ownership and thus control of Swedish companies after 25 years. When Social Democratic Party leader Olof Palme adopted the Meidner Plan proposal ahead of the 1982 Swedish general election and then won, the whole world took notice. The New York Times declared that it could be the end of the middle way, which they clarified as the socialism carried on in Sweden from 1932 to 1976, that mostly left ownership in private hands. They went on to note the irony of the fact that the plan's transition to collective ownership relied upon the country's stock market, the heart of capitalism. The Christian Science Monitor called it a socialist program masterminded by Marxist economists of the Swedish Confederation of Trade Unions, and quoted various critics of the plan. Economist Per Martin Meyerson is quoted as saying that after the plan, the market economy would cease to exist. Stig Andersson, the manager of the Swedish band ABBA, is reported to have organized a concert to help finance the fight against the socialist takeover, and was quoted as saying an SPD electoral victory might be the first time that a country will freely vote to go behind the Iron Curtain. Despite the hysterical response, the plan was implemented in 1984, though in a diminished form. Under the program, the government imposed a relatively small excess profit tax on companies rather than require them to directly issue shares and create regional funds to hold the assets rather than the wage earner funds originally proposed by Meidner. Nonetheless, the cash received from the excess profit tax was used to purchase shares of Swedish corporations, and the program managed to buy up to 7% of Swedish company stock by 1991. So I wonder if this is like public equity or private equity as well. I mean, I assume it's everything, right? So, I mean, 7% of sort of total national equity ownership is a pretty large amount, I imagine. So, unfortunately, after the country's 1991 general election, Sweden formed a conservative government that put a halt to the program. A lot of attention is paid to Sweden's experience with the wage earner funds. Leftist thinkers, in particular, often lamented as the last great push for practical democratic socialism. But this morning is mistaken. As noted already above, the world of social wealth funds is far more vibrant now than it ever has been. In fact, over the past few decades, Norway, Sweden's neighbor, has quietly put together the largest complex of sovereign wealth funds in the world, dwarfing what Sweden's wage earner funds managed to achieve. So from Sweden's failure to Norway's triumph. Norway's central government currently manages three main asset pools. There is the Government Pension Fund Norway, GPF Norway, a stock and bond portfolio that is invested in Norwegian and other Nordic companies. The Government Pension Fund Global, GPF Global, a stock, bond, and real estate portfolio invested exclusively outside of Norway. And the State-Owned Enterprises, a set of 74 domestic companies that are directly owned by 12 government ministries. Let's see. The Global Pension Fund Norway and the Global Pension Fund Global are social wealth funds. The SOE assets, because they are owned directly by ministries rather than through a fund, are not technically a social wealth fund, but those SOEs are nonetheless in the spirit of a sovereign wealth fund and could be rolled into a sovereign wealth fund if the Norwegian state wanted to do so. Adding up all the wealth collectively owned through the Norwegian state produces some truly staggering figures. At the end of 2016, GPF Norway controlled assets equal to 7% of Norway's GDP. I don't really like figures like this. GPF Global owned assets equal to 241% of GDP, and the SOE equity holdings were valued at 23% of GDP. Right? I mean, I don't really like these types of statistics because you're comparing a wealth statistic to basically a flow, right? So you've got the GDP, which is basically the collective sum of prices of goods and services in the economy. But then versus a measure of wealth, which is sort of a sum of the actual net value of all the assets that generate income in the economy. I don't think wealth to GDP statistics really. I mean, they're interesting, I guess, but they're not. It doesn't really tell me how much state ownership. I mean, before, right? He talks about 7% of Swedish company stock. That would be more interesting, right? If you were to tell me like, oh, between these SOEs and the domestic wealth fund, they own 38% of domestic company stock. That would be more interesting to me than like a wealth to GDP figure. Maybe he'll get to that, later on. But thus, altogether, Norwegian central government owned assets equal to 271% of the country's GDP in 2016. To put this in perspective, for the U.S. government to own a similar amount of wealth, it would need to build a $54 trillion social wealth fund. The SOEs, GPF Norway, and other local government funds combine to own a little more than 1/3 of all equity listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange. This level of ownership is nearly 5 times what the Meidner plan achieved before it was halted. See, but this is a little misleading as well. I don't want to say misleading, because obviously I don't think that's what Matt is trying to do here, but owning 1/3 of equity listed on a stock exchange is not the same as owning 1/3 of equity as a whole, right? So, for instance, when he says 7% of Swedish company stock, well, there's a lot of companies that aren't listed on any exchange because they're privately owned, right? Most of the sort of corporate wealth in the country is very likely not listed on the sort of Oslo or Swedish domestic stock exchange, right? Now, this is still very interesting. It's very interesting that a company or that the government manages and owns 1/3 of all equity listed on the domestic stock exchange. But that's, if we take that and look at the actual domestic wealth of corporations, I wouldn't be surprised if it was less than 5% or something like that, right? But that's sort of a digression. It's just something that sort of colors that a little bit more. So let's see. There was a cap on how much equity could the employee invest in an investment fund buy, sadly. Usually when I deal with leftists that say capitalism taking care of the environment are mutually exclusive, usually I ask them what they mean exactly of taking care of the environment. I am confused. What is wrong with these statistics you're seeing? Man, I wish I took a statistics course. So the issue is that, for instance, it's sort of like saying, let's say that my wealth is, let's say an average person, right? Your wealth is your house, the equity that you have in your house, maybe your 401k, retirement plan, and your car or something like that. And let's say that someone's wealth is, given those figures, let's say that someone's wealth is $200,000, right? Now, if you were to tell me that this person has a wealth to income ratio of like 5 to 1 or something like that, right? Or well, maybe that's extreme, like 2 to 1, right? They have, a 200% or 100% of their wealth to income, right? Because they have $200,000 in wealth and they make $100,000 a year. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to tell me. You know what I mean? Right? It doesn't tell me too much, right? And similarly, when you're talking about determining sort of levels of state ownership, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges, right? The percentage of wealth owned by the government is really more important than the percentage of wealth owned by the government as a ratio to the GDP of a country, right? That's a little bit different if you're trying to think about the proportional levels of government ownership. He actually does a better job later down here where he says that Norway and other local government funds combined own about a third of equity listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange. That's better in my view because it's sort of publicly traded equities. Of the publicly traded equities, then the government, the sort of state of Norway, owns about a third of that, right? So that's an interesting statistic. Due to its collective wealth funds and SOEs, the Norwegian government owns around 59% of the country's wealth. See, this is kind of the statistic I was looking for from the beginning. To reiterate, 6 out of every 10 kroner, which is the Norwegian currency, of wealth in Norway is owned by the state. When you exclude owner-occupied homes from the calculation, you find that the state of Norway owns 76% of the country's non-home wealth. For comparison, the Chinese government only owns 31% of its national wealth. These holdings generate a considerable amount of income. Over the last 10 years, the conservatively invested GPF Global generated an average annual return of 5.9%. Over the same period, GPF Norway had an 8.3% average return. In 2017, GPF Global generated a return of 1,028 billion kroner, while GPF Norway had a return of 26 billion kroner. In 2016, the SOE portfolio produced a 33 billion kroner dividend for the state. Adding the 2016 SOE figure to the 2017 figures for GPF Norway and GPF Global gives you a total return of 1,087 billion kroner, or $133 billion USD equivalent. Had that money been paid out as a dividend to all 5.2 million Norwegians, it would have provided each with $25,500 or $102,000 for every family of 4. The Norwegian funds are also efficiently administered. In 2017, GPF Global's expenses were equal to 0.06% of the assets under management, and GPF Norway's expenses were 0.07% of its assets. These expense ratios are near the lowest in the world, even when comparing them to private asset management, and this is despite the fact that the funds are actively managed. To be sure, Norway is an outlier in the world in terms of just how much wealth it has accumulated in its various sovereign wealth funds. But this is also what makes it such a promising example. The idea that a society could collectively own 3/4 of its non-home wealth through social wealth funds administered by a democratically elected government without any negative economic consequences would be rejected as preposterous by most political and economic commentators in America today. But that is precisely what Norway has done, and seemingly what any country could do if it has the necessary will and competence. Moving on, the Alaska Permanent Fund. Perhaps a great example of the model of American sovereign wealth funds that could be possible. The United States is already home to a handful of sovereign wealth funds. There is the Permanent School Fund and Permanent University Fund in Texas, the State School Fund in Utah, and the Common School Fund in Oregon, to name a few. By far the most interesting and largest of those funds is the Alaska Permanent Fund. What sets the APF apart from virtually all other sovereign wealth funds in the world is that the Alaska Permanent Fund pays an annual cash dividend to every citizen of Alaska. It is thus a homegrown model of the kind of sovereign wealth fund I think the federal government should implement on the national level. The Alaska Permanent Fund only exists today because Alaska Governor Jay Hammond was obsessed with the idea of dividend-paying sovereign wealth funds. Bristol Bay failure. Before his stint as governor during the 1960s, Hammond was the manager of a 2,000-person municipality in Alaska called Bristol Bay Borough. Bristol Bay was teeming with salmon resources, but 97% of those resources were being extracted by Seattle-based firms, not local fishermen. The Seattle-based firms even preferred hiring non-residents to staff their fishing operations, meaning that the local population was largely locked out of the job opportunities the salmon catch provided. This situation resulted in serious economic deprivation for Bristol Bay residents. Quote, no high school, sewer or water system, healthcare facilities, fire, police, or ambulance services. The town's garbage, quote, was dumped over the riverbank in hopes it would flush out with the ice during high spring tides. And this is Jay Hammond, very outback Alaskan-looking man, very manly-looking man, if I say so myself. Hammond hit upon an idea to reverse this dynamic. He proposed imposing a 3% tax on the fish catch and using the revenue to build out a, quote, conservatively managed investment account that would pay the residents an annual dividend from its investment returns. Since 97% of the fishing was done by non-local firms, this would mean that 97% of the tax would be paid by non-local firms. Despite its seeming appeal, Hammond's proposed ordinance failed at the polls, apparently due to anti-tax sentiments. Hammond did manage to pass the tax a few years later in exchange for an elimination of the local property tax. The massive tax take from the fishing transferred the borough into the, quote, The massive tax take from the fishing transformed the borough into, quote, the richest municipality in the nation on a per capita basis, according to Fortune magazine, but Hammond nonetheless lamented his failure to establish a universal basic dividend in Bristol Bay. Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act failure. Undeterred by his mixed success at Bristol Bay, Hammond again tried to establish a dividend-paying social wealth fund in 1971 on the heels of a $900 million settlement that the federal government had entered into with the indigenous people of the state. Hammond was asked to make recommendations about how the natives could use that money, and he suggested they put it in a big fund and use the investment return to pay annual dividends to all Alaskan natives. As in Bristol Bay, Hammond's idea was rejected. The native leadership decided instead to invest the money into the creation of over 200 native businesses. This was not the diversified social wealth fund of Hammond's dreams, but the native-owned enterprises did nonetheless produce dividends for Alaskan natives in most cases. And finally, success at last. When Hammond became governor of Alaska in 1974, he found another opportunity to replicate what he did in Bristol Bay. The state's gas severance tax was about half the national average, but most of the extracted gasoline was being sold abroad. So, he proposed doubling the gas severance tax, creating a $150 state income tax credit to offset any increase in gas prices in the state, and storing the remainder of the revenue in the general fund. This proposal passed. Hammond's tax and dividend proposal was a success, but not completely. Quote, I found almost no one remembered the tax credit, Hammond wrote later. Quote, at the point I decided that if another dividend program were established, I wanted to put a check in everyone's hand rather than simply a credit for those making sufficient income to pay a state income tax. I thought that by doing so, people would better recognize and appreciate the dividend concept and demand the state maximize return from its resource wealth. And this is exactly what Hammond did. In 1976, he got the legislature to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot that would require that, quote, 25% of all mineral lease rentals, royalties, royalty sale proceeds, federal mineral revenue sharing payments, and bonuses received by the state shall be placed in a permanent Alaska fund, the principal of which shall be used only for those income-producing investments specifically designated by law as established for permanent fund investments. The measure passed by a 2-to-1 margin. In 1977, the Alaska Permanent Fund received its first deposit, $734,000 from oil royalties. In 1980, the legislature created a state-owned enterprise called the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation to manage the Alaska Permanent Fund and create the Permanent Fund Dividend Program that began paying dividends to the citizens of Alaska 2 years later. Those dividends continue to flow to this day. After 15 years of trying, Jay Hammond's dream of establishing a social wealth fund that paid out a universal basic dividend finally became a reality. The fund today. At the end of 2017, the Alaska Permanent Fund owned just under $60 billion of assets. This is equal to around 113% of the state's GDP. A similarly sized fund for the United States would need to be around $22 trillion. The assets are invested in a broad and diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, real estate, and other ventures. You can see that here: public equities, fixed income, private equity, growth opportunities, real estate, private income, all these different things that you can invest money in, very diversified. Across its 34-year existence, the Alaska Permanent Fund has achieved an average annual investment return of 8.78%. The APF's performance is slightly below its benchmark index across the entire 34-year horizon, but quite a bit above the same index in more recent years. This seems to indicate the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation is getting better at asset management over time. Nonetheless, the main drivers of the Alaska Permanent Fund's return in any given year are general economic conditions. The Alaska Permanent Fund is in orange, the benchmark is in sort of turquoise, and the median public fund is in, I suppose, a slightly lighter version of orange. When the fund is operating normally, a portion of its investment return is plowed back into the fund for inflation-proofing purposes. The remainder of the fund is transferred to the Alaska Department of Revenue in order to pay out the permanent fund dividend to citizens of the state. The dividend amount is calculated as, quote, 21% of the net income of the fund for the last 5 fiscal years. This calculation essentially means that the dividends are based on a 5-year moving average of the fund's return. Both the inflation-proofing and dividend issuance is subject to the legislature's approval, which it has occasionally withheld. In 2017, the Alaska government paid out a dividend of $1,100 to 629,859 citizens. This is equal to $4,400 for a family of 4. In an unusual move, the $1,100 dividend was dictated by a legislative action as opposed to the statutory formula, and was lower than it would have been under the formula. In prior years, the dividend went as high as $2,072 or $8,288 for a family of 4. The program effects. Despite its novelty and size, there have been relatively few serious efforts to evaluate the Alaska Permanent Fund's effects. One reason for this might be that, quote, many people view the PFD as a distribution of income from assets owned by individual citizens rather than an appropriation of government. Put differently, because Alaskans generally view their dividend income as coming from their ownership of the fund, they seem to think that how people spend it and other similar questions are irrelevant. Nonetheless, we do know that, all else equal, a flat dividend payment like this should reduce inequality in the state. Receiving $8,000 in dividend payments increases the income of a family with $20,000 of earnings by 40%, and the income of a family with $200,000 of earnings by 4%. This sort of pattern will compress the distribution of the state's disposable income under typical inequality measures, and in 2016, Alaska was the most equal state in the country. That's actually very interesting. I didn't know that. In 2016, Alaska was the most equal state in the country based on this citation number 51. I feel like I'm interested to look into that later. I've never heard of someone actually doing an equality measure for individual states. Gotta find my spot back. Equal state in the country. There we go. Similarly, we know that a payment like this should reduce poverty in the state. Figuring out just how much it reduces poverty is difficult because census income surveys frequently fail to record dividend income for Alaskans. But one estimate from Matthew Berman and Random Remy, interesting, this person's name is Random, I've never heard of that as a name before, interesting, suggests that the payment reduces the poverty rate in the state by 20%. Some might worry that these sorts of dividend payments could significantly reduce employment in the state because they make working less necessary for survival, but a study by Damon Jones and Iona Marinescu found that the dividend had no effect on overall employment rates, though it did seem to coincide with higher levels of part-time as opposed to full-time work. Jones and Marinescu also found support for the theory that the dividend payment increased consumption and thereby increased demand for labor in the state. Although the precise economic effects of the program are somewhat unclear, public opinion about the program is not. The Alaskan people love it. 40% of Alaskans say the dividend make a great deal or quite a bit of difference in their lives. 39% say they make a fair amount or only some difference in their lives, and only 20% say that they make no difference. Those saying the dividends make the most difference in their lives are women without a college degree, unmarried women, mothers with children, and Native Alaskan women. Nearly 80% of Alaskans say, quote, the PFD checks are an important source of income for people in my community. 84% agree with the statement that, quote, as owners of the Alaska Permanent Fund, Alaska residents are entitled to an equal share of earnings of the fund. And 74% take that all the way to its extreme, saying they agree that millionaires should receive the dividend as well. The Alaska Permanent Fund is so beloved in Alaska that 64% of residents would rather create a state income tax, Alaska currently lacks one, rather than reduce dividends in order to cover the state's projected budget shortfall. To reiterate, residents in one of the most conservative states in the country support paying a state income tax in order to preserve a universal basic dividend program. All right, the American Solidarity Fund. Before that, let's read chat for a second here. Let's see. I think these could work on a state level. I also don't have faith in this working on the federal level. Well, Pien, I'm not sure why you wouldn't have faith in it working on a federal level. It probably worked federally too, but I could see the U.S. doing the 51 state patchwork solution. Well, that's pretty normal. Let's see. Let's see. Jaguar Chan. Yeah, just send it to me on Twitter or on Discord, right? So yeah, links like that aren't allowed in my chat just to avoid spam and whatnot. Andrew Meller says hi. Hello, Andrew Meller. All right, moving on. I love you, Econoboy. Well, I love you too, Maxf. Thank you. Moving on, the American Solidarity Fund, the quote-unquote detailed proposal from Matt Bruenig to establish a sort of collectively owned sovereign wealth fund that pays a universal dividend to citizens of America. Let's see how this would be structured in Matt's eyes. The United States government should create a national social wealth fund along the same lines as the Alaska Permanent Fund. For the purposes of this paper, I will call the proposed fund the American Solidarity Fund. The American Solidarity Fund will operate the same way that any other social wealth fund operates. Money and assets will be placed into the fund. A public entity will manage those assets in a way that generates investment returns. Then those investment returns will be used to fund social spending. In this case, a universal basic dividend for the citizens of the country. The remainder of this section provides details for the various aspects of the American Solidarity Fund. Not every detail is essential, and there are multiple ways to do most things. Where multiple options exist, I try to detail all the options and provide my recommendation. To begin, how to bring assets into the fund. Generally speaking, there are 5 ways to bring assets into a social wealth fund. Number 1, voluntary contributions. Number 2, ring fencing existing state assets. Number 3, levies. Number 4, leveraged purchases. And number 5, monetary seigniorage. I recommend all of the above, but think only the latter 3 are likely to provide substantial ongoing inflows of assets. So he's not a big fan of voluntary contributions and ring fencing existing state assets. Voluntary contributions. Adding assets to the American Solidarity Fund through voluntary contributions is pretty simple. The administrators of the American Solidarity Fund will create a way for people to donate money or other kinds of assets to the fund, and the government will encourage people to contribute. Lynn Stout and Sergio Gramito favored this approach in their social wealth fund proposal. In their paper, they argued that, quote, ultra high net worth individuals are a significant potential source of social wealth fund donations, in part because, quote, this cohort already frequently participates in philanthropy, and because for the ultra wealthy, quote, philanthropy is the only real place money can go. They also note that, quote, if the top decile of equity holders contribute half of their holdings to the social wealth fund while living or upon death, the fund would, within a few decades, come to hold 40% of all corporate equities. Man, that seems like a very generous analysis, expecting all these wealthy people to just donate a bunch of assets to the government. I don't know about that. Stout and Gramito argue that corporations might, quote, also have reason to donate their own shares. Contributions to the fund would be good public relations and could be used by companies to counterbalance, quote, the influence of short-term shareholders, especially activist hedge funds. I am skeptical that the level of voluntary contributions would be high enough to create an adequately sized social wealth fund, but certainly nothing is lost by allowing such contributions to be made. Ring fencing existing assets. Another way to grow the fund would be to transfer existing state assets into it. Dag Detter and Stefan Fulster are the most prominent advocates of this approach. The United States government owns a large amount of physical assets. Those assets include over 450 million acres worth of land valued at $1.8 trillion, over 900,000 buildings worth hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of miles of intercoastal waterway, and countless infrastructure projects. The government also owns the electromagnetic spectrum, which is currently auctions off to telecommunications companies. After depositing these and other existing assets into the American Solidarity Fund, the fund could generate income from them by renting them out or, where appropriate, selling them and using the revenues from the sales to buy other more promising assets, such as stocks and bonds. Some of the land and building assets are already being used by the federal government for other purposes. After making the American Solidarity Fund the owner of the land and buildings, the other governmental agencies could be made to pay rent to the American Solidarity Fund for their use. Insofar as handling physical assets is labor intensive, this particular source of assets will probably be the most difficult to manage. Levies. The government could also bring assets into the fund through levies, i.e. taxes and fees. Any type of levy could conceivably serve this purpose. For instance, Peter Barnes proposed, among other things, a value-added tax on the telecommunications sector, which is a type of consumption tax. During its 1971 Congress, Denmark's trade unions proposed building a social wealth fund using a payroll tax, which is a type of labor tax. Although levies on consumption and labor can work, levies on capital seem to be a more neutral way to go. After all, the purpose of a social wealth fund is to transfer wealth into a collective pool. Applying new levies directly on wealth seems to serve that purpose the best. Thus, what follows are a variety of capital taxes and fees that I think would be ideal mechanisms for bringing assets into the American Solidarity Fund. One-time market capitalization tax. To jumpstart the fund, the government could impose a one-time tax on the market capitalization of public and possibly non-public companies. Companies would have the option of paying this tax in cash or through scrip, i.e. by issuing new shares to the American Solidarity Fund. The SEC already imposes a 0.01245% market capitalization tax on newly issued securities, which it calls a filing fee. At the end of 2017, the market capitalization of listed domestic companies was $32.1 trillion. A one-off 3% market capitalization tax would thus bring in around $1 trillion of assets, and this would amount to only a few months of total return provided by the stock of these companies. Outgoing market capitalization tax. To continue bringing the money into the fund, the government could impose an ongoing market capitalization taxes. This would be done at a lower rate, e.g. 0.5% per year. As with the one-time tax, the SEC could administer this ongoing tax since it already imposes such a tax on newly issued securities. Number 3, an IPO tax. When a company goes public through an initial public offering, its stock becomes much easier to trade. This liquidity is highly valued by investors, and so they are willing to pay more money for publicly traded stock than they are for private equity. This liquidity premium is estimated to increase the value of publicly traded stock by around 20 to 30%. Since it is the government that creates the uniform and tightly regulated securities markets that make this liquidity premium possible, it stands to reason that it should share in the value it creates. The 0.01245% market capitalization filing fee currently charged by the SEC is too low. It should be raised to, for example, 5%, payable in scrip or cash. For consistency purposes, the IPO tax should also be assessed when public companies acquire private companies. Mergers and acquisitions tax. The government could impose a tax payable in scrip or cash on companies that merge with or acquire other companies. The FTC already imposes such a tax in the form of the fees it collects during pre-merger reporting under the Hart-Scott-Rodino SHR Antitrust Improvement Act of 1976. The current SHR fee ranges from $45,000 to $280,000 depending on the value of the transaction in question. The new tax should be, much higher, e.g. 3% of the value of the transaction with some minimum threshold so as to exclude very small businesses. The FTC can collect the tax just as it already collects the HSR fees. To avoid duplication, this tax would only be assessed where the IPO tax discussed above is not assessed. Number 5, a financial transactions tax. The government could levy modest taxes on the volume of financial transactions. Dean Baker estimated in 2016 that a 0.2% tax on stock trades, a 0.1% tax on bond trades, and a 0.002% tax on derivative trades would bring in around $120 billion or 0.6% of GDP. It is worth noting that the SEC already has a very modest financial transactions tax. It is set to 0.00231% of the value of securities transactions. FINRA also charges a trading activity fee, TAF, for certain security transactions, which is similar to a financial transactions tax. Number 6, securities custodian tax. Most securities are held by a custodian company, such as the Depository Trust Company. When securities are traded, they do not change hands, but rather book entry changes are made by the custodian, indicating the new owner. The DTC boasts that it is the custodian of more than 1.3 million active securities issued, valued at $54.2 trillion as of July 31st, 2017. An annual tax on securities custodians of 0.1% could pull in $54 billion from the DTC alone. Presumably, the DTC would pass that along to the companies issuing the securities. Fund management tax. Many investors own shares of funds that themselves own a large basket of various securities. These funds make money by charging fees equal to a percentage of the assets in these funds. Typical management fees are between 0.51% of assets and 0.74% of assets, depending on the fund type. Some go as low as 0.03%. The federal government could impose its own asset under management tax for these kinds of funds, e.g., 0.05%. Fund managers would pass this through as slightly higher management fees for their overwhelmingly affluent investors. Number 8, inheritance and gift tax. The U.S. only has a tiny tax on very large estates, despite the fact that around 60% of U.S. wealth has been inherited. Inheritance taxes and gift taxes should be massively increased for their revenues, going into the American Solidarity Fund as a collective inheritance for everyone, not just the children of the affluent. Elimination of certain tax expenditures. The U.S. currently has a variety of tax breaks oriented towards promoting individual asset building. These tax breaks are giveaways to the rich and do not appear to achieve their stated purpose of incentivizing savings. These tax expenditures should be eliminated and the revenue redirected to the American Solidarity Fund, which will directly increase the wealth of everyone in the country by an equal amount. The Joint Committee on Taxation recently estimated that in 2018, the mortgage interest tax deduction and the exclusion of capital gains on sales of principal residencies costs $105 billion. The reduced tax rates on dividends and long-term capital gains costs $135 billion. The exclusion of capital gains at death costs $35 billion, and tax exclusions for pension and IRA contributions costs $240 billion. Altogether, that's $515 billion per year. These are not the only possible levies, but they are particularly promising levies that directly embody the idea of shifting assets away from the wealthy into a collective fund. Okay, so I'll be honest, guys, I don't like almost any of these ideas. I really don't. I think that if you're talking, I don't think that the logic of the levy section, which is to say that, you know, if the goal is to socialize a portion of capital rent, you know, focusing taxes on the rent, you know, side of capital and capital itself is maybe a logic that doesn't fail to make sense entirely. But my thought on this is, you know, all of these taxes seem a little bit hard to administer, a little bit hard to, you know, collect, perhaps would lead to poor incentives, right? So a market capitalization tax might incentivize companies to just not go public and stay private for longer than otherwise. A market capitalization tax every year would just do the same thing. An IPO tax would do the exact same thing that I'm talking about. Mergers and acquisition tax, like, it seems like you're interfering with just the sort of basic, you know, efficient allocation of capital in that regard. A financial transactions tax would do the same thing. It seems like empirically financial transaction taxes don't actually do they don't do very much good. A securities custodian tax, if they're just passing it on anyway, it doesn't seem like it would be totally necessarily totally efficient. A fund management tax, very similar, sort of almost like a franchise tax on funds. Inheritance and gift taxes, I think, are good, but they're good for a reason that I'm about to mention. And then the elimination of certain tax expenditures, that's a little bit different than a levy. Certainly, it's getting rid of certain tax breaks, which you could consider a tax. But overall, I would just say that the reason inheritance and gift taxes maybe would make more sense because it's only one time, and it's on the sort of book value of those assets in the first place, right? And so why potentially create all of these negative impacts and negative incentives? But instead, why don't you just increase the capital gains tax rate and just use that, which is essentially a transaction tax on the sale of capital, and just put that money into a sovereign wealth fund? I mean, I think we raised like $100 or $200 billion a year just from the capital gains tax. So, you know, I think you'd be avoiding potentially many more negative sort of incentives in the market if you were to do that, versus having all these sort of disparate methods of collecting tax essentially on the wealth of capital and capital accumulation. You know, just do a capital gains tax. And you know, one thing that he doesn't mention is things like, you know, land value taxes or resource taxes or, you know, Pigovian taxes, things that, again, don't necessarily potentially cause these problems with sort of you know, wealth incentives and sort of directional movements of wealth that might be negative. I just don't see the reason for it when there's other taxes that are probably better at raising revenue efficiently than these sorts of, you know, more capital focused taxes, right? But again, you can do things like the, you know, lowering expenditures, inheritance taxes, capital gains taxes, things like that. You know, I don't see a lot of good empirical results from things like transaction taxes or franchise taxes, you know, M&A tax, things like that. I'm just, you know, it doesn't seem to me that they're really that great. So I'm surprised frankly, he didn't mention any of the taxes that I thought would be, generally accepted to be good taxes for funneling money into a sovereign wealth fund. So, all right, leveraged purchases, I should say. Government could also borrow money at low interest rates to invest in financial assets with high rates of return. Between 1990 and 2017, the average interest rate for a one-year Treasury bond purchased on the first day of the year was 3.17%. During the same time, the average total return on the S&P 500 was 11.3%. The difference between them, 8.13%, is the approximate rate of return that could be accomplished by an American Solidarity Fund that issued government debt in order to buy stock equity. For example, if the American Solidarity Fund existed between 1990 and 2017 and borrowed $1 trillion per year at the prevailing one-year Treasury bond rate and invested that $1 trillion into the S&P 500, it would have generated a cumulative return over the period of $2.275 trillion nominal dollars. That return could have been directly parceled out as dividends or been deposited towards the principal of the American Solidarity Fund. In the above example, the American Solidarity Fund issues debt and buys stock regardless of the relative prices of each security. In a more realistic scenario, the American Solidarity Fund would be able to make better decisions about when such a move is the most likely to generate an investment return. So it would not borrow money to invest when treasury rates or price-to-earnings ratios are especially high. In general, because the return on U.S. government debt is lower than the return on other kinds of marketable securities, the U.S. government should be able to take advantage of that and spread to generate investment returns. I think this could make sense as a way to establish sort of your base funds in a sovereign wealth fund managed by the government. But I think ongoing leveraged purchases, I'm not sure makes a ton of sense, especially if you want to diversify, right? So not everything you're investing in is going to be the high return equities of stock, right? A lot of it is also going to be very risky, right? So if you're leveraging your fund over and over again to achieve sort of equity or private equity returns, that's very risky, right? And it's not diversified. You're going to be buying bonds and real estate and CDs and things that are very, very stable and not very high return, right? So I'm not sure if ongoing leveraged investment makes sense for a government fund, and I'm not sure I don't know if there's a lot of examples of other sovereign wealth funds doing that. So, I mean, again, even on the tax section, I don't know if there's a lot of empirics on these different sort of capital taxes being levied to fund sovereign wealth funds. I think most of the sovereign wealth funds in the world are predicated on funds related to some structure in the economy, right? So in Norway, the funds come from like the pension system or from the oil wealth of the country, sort of the land rent associated with oil wealth. Saudi Arabia, the same thing, right? In Singapore, they're such a trade hub that they use their foreign exchange reserves to invest in assets and sort of generate capital income, right? So this, and I think at least he doesn't give examples here, and I think that a lot of these taxes don't have great empirical foundations. So monetary seigniorage. The Federal Reserve makes adjustments to the money supply by purchasing securities through open market operations. The way this works is that the Federal Reserve creates new money and then buys assets with it. Right now, I think we're going down potentially a bad road on this one. Right now, the Federal Reserve almost always chooses to buy treasury bonds, but the government could require that the Federal Reserve inject money into the system by buying more lucrative securities such as publicly traded equities. This is what the Bank of Japan has been doing for the last few years. In January of 2008, the Bank of Japan owned just 1.5 trillion yen of stocks, shares, and shares of exchange-traded funds, and shares of real estate investment trusts. In May of this year, the same figure was 21 trillion yen, which is equal to $193 billion. During the same period, the Federal Reserve also expanded its balance sheet considerably by buying treasury bonds. In January of 2008, the Federal Reserve owned $740 billion of treasury bonds. In May of this year, it was a little under 2.4 trillion. Had the Federal Reserve instead chosen to buy up total stock market exchange-traded funds like the Bank of Japan did, it could have profited handsomely off the massive stock market rise over that period. And if those assets were connected to the American Solidarity Fund, the profits could have been paid out to everyone in the country through the corresponding universal basic dividend program. In addition to directing the Federal Reserve to buy other kinds of securities, the government could also adopt a higher inflation target, e.g. 4% rather than the current 2%, an idea that already has significant support on the merits. A higher inflation target would permit larger expansions of the money supply and therefore enable more purchases of return-generating assets. Okay, so I think that this is a potentially dangerous line of thought. The reason I say that is because I think that when you use the phrase like the government should direct the Federal Reserve to do certain things, is that the Federal Reserve and central banks in each country are oftentimes the most institutionally strong institutions, I should just say, entities in governments, right? Because they're typically, the way you would manage them is very hands-off, very much, not political actors telling the Federal Reserve what to do. I mean, even Trump didn't fire the Federal Reserve chair when he really didn't care for the Federal Reserve chair for many assorted reasons. And so I don't think the idea of the Federal Reserve printing money and then using that to buy a diversified basket of assets and then transferring those assets to American Solidarity Fund is necessarily the worst thing in the world. It's just that when we consider the context of the Bank of Japan and the American government buying treasuries with created money, that's with specific goals in mind. And one of those goals isn't to create a large American Solidarity Fund or a large diversified set of assets. It's to shore up the capital markets of a country. And although from Matt's perspective, that might seem very sort of trivial and marginal, it is important, an important distinction, because we probably wouldn't want political actors to just be printing money and then buying a random assortment of assets in general, right? Is that you probably want the money for those to be costed through taxation or through the accumulation of land rents and resource wealth and things like that, right? I think that this idea is probably something that just, to me, seems very dangerous and misplaced. I don't think that this would be a great way to generate funds on a regular basis, right? If you wanted to say, hey, why not do quantitative easing with more than just basically debt, right? Because right now, quantitative easing includes treasuries, but also corporate debt. Corporate debt as a result of the 2020 pandemic was included. So why not equities, right? That's not the most unfair thing to say, right? Because you want to, again, shore up equity markets. And if you wanted to say, hey, that you're injecting those financial assets into the market in the terms of cash and then transferring those funds to the American Solidarity Fund for management, sure, maybe that's reasonable. It's just I could see if that was a regular occurrence, the expectations of investors potentially being very bad. And I think there's even some growing concern in general with quantitative easing and the idea that the federal government or the Federal Reserve is like printing money, or central banks are printing money essentially just to shore up certain capital markets. Like, I think that the jury is still somewhat out on whether or not that's even necessarily a good thing to do in general, right? So I'm pretty skeptical of this as a method, especially relative to essentially just collectivized resource rents or capital rents, like, capital gains taxation and stuff like that, as means to funnel money into such a fund. I think that this one, a lot of his levies he recommended, and it was this last one, it was a lot of the levies he suggested, and then also this last one of basically printing money and just buying assets with it. I think that those are potentially pretty negative ways to bring money into the programs. And again, I don't think that, to be fair, I'm not sure about what the Bank of Japan does with the returns on the capital they buy in this regard, but I think that in general, I would be pretty skeptical of this as a method to generate good regular returns of assets into the American Solidarity Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of America. So, all right, managing the fund. After assets are brought into the American Solidarity Fund, they have to be managed in some way. The management of the American Solidarity Fund presents three main questions. Number one, what entity will manage it? Number two, what assets will it hold? And three, how will it exercise its ownership rights over its assets? These questions are answered in order below. Number one, the managing entity. The cleanest way to manage the American Solidarity Fund is by creating a new state-owned enterprise, SOE, that is fully owned by the Treasury Department, and then hiring that SOE to be the fund manager. This is the model used by the Alaska Permanent Fund and GPF Norway. Well, that's technically true. What he's not mentioning here is that the GPF Global, which is like the giant sovereign wealth fund that Norway has, the much, much, much bigger sovereign wealth fund, that's actually managed by the central bank, right? It's not that it's necessarily bad to have this fund managed by the Treasury. It's just that the Treasury is a political body, right? There's political actors running the Treasury. And in general, right, it would be very important to me how we specifically organize the management of such a fund so as it's insulated from potential political gamesmanship, right? You have to keep in mind, right? Donald Trump, if he was president, would have control over the Treasury Department that controlled a potential, trillions of dollars sovereign wealth fund. And it's not that that's necessarily wrong. It's just we have to consider that sometimes crazy people are in charge of the presidency, and sometimes crazy people put crazy people in charge of the Treasury, and sometimes those crazy people in charge of the Treasury might really fuck up what is something that is very important, which is potentially trillions and trillions of dollars of collectively owned wealth, right? So it's just, to me, it would be very important how something like this was managed and how we insulated it from potential political actors, right? You could even establish, not necessarily under the Treasury, you could establish even a separate department like the Federal Reserve was established, right? The Federal Reserve was an entity created by Congress in order to manage essentially the financial operations in the country, and had these different sort of goals and whatnot. And so establishing an SOE, I should say, that's independent from even the Treasury, to me would maybe make the most sense if you're uncomfortable with just the Federal Reserve managing it. But that's kind of my thought. In Alaska, the SOE is called the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. You mentioned that before. And in Norway, it is called I remember pronouncing this for the video I did on sovereign wealth funds, the Folketrygdefondent. I still don't know how to pronounce it. Here's the Folketrygdefondent management team. Interesting. The way that this would work in practice is that pursuant to a new act of Congress, the Treasury Department would create a new corporation. Let's call it the American Solidarity Fund Corporation. The Treasury would formulate articles of incorporation for the American Solidarity Fund Corporation and appoint its board members, board chairs, and auditor. See, right there, I think I already have a problem with how he's structuring this, because, right, if the Treasury appointing the board of this fund, right? So again, Trump could just fire everyone on this board and replace it with completely insane people, right? It's already, this is a somewhat precarious way to establish the board itself, right? I would almost prefer a circularity board, kind of how almost I think like nonprofits are organized, where the board appoints the board in the future, right? So kind of my thoughts. So from there, the American Solidarity Fund's corporate board would be responsible for the management of the American Solidarity Fund Corporation, including the election of the American Solidarity Fund Corporation's CEO. All right. Once Harold, Spirit Ambassador, donated $49.99 through Super Chat. Thank you so much, Harold. Good to see you in chat. Hello, Bank Boy. Hope you are doing well. I feel like talking about a sovereign wealth fund right now in such an highly politicized environment is wrong, considering with a GOP House sovereign debt default is looming. I don't think it's a bad time to talk about it. In general, this is just a policy proposal to think about for the future. So. Trump literally wanted to put people on the reserve who wanted to return to the gold standard. They were really, really wacky. Yeah, exactly, right. I'd be very concerned about the political insulation of such a fund. That is arguably the most important question of forming a national sovereign wealth fund, or forming an endowment fund, or forming a city pension fund, is how is it managed? How do we insulate the management of this fund from potential political corruption, political gamesmanship? That's arguably the most important question. So once the responsibility for managing the funds, the American Solidarity Fund, is handed over to the American Solidarity Fund Corporation, the Treasury would not be involved in the day-to-day operations of the fund, but it would be able to create rules, mandates, directives, and other sorts of guidance that the American Solidarity Fund Corporation would have to follow. This kind of separation will reduce the administrative burden that the Treasury has to take on itself and provide a certain level of operational independence for the fund managers. As with the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation, we should expect the American Solidarity Fund Corporation to start out as a fledgling organization and evolve over time into a mature and professionalized operation. This evolution would also likely mean that the American Solidarity Fund Corporation would initially rely on some level of outsourcing to carry out its business, but in the medium and long term would seek to do all of its fund management with its own staff. Number 2, asset allocation. What assets the American Solidarity Fund will hold is ultimately a political question that will in practice be answered by the U.S. Congress or by Treasury mandates that the American Solidarity Fund Corporation has to follow. See, again, this is where the structure is very paranoia-inducing, right? Because imagine Ron DeSantis, right? Ron DeSantis running the American Solidarity Fund. He says, no, the Treasury will never invest in renewable energy as long as I'm president. The Treasury we're going to double down on our fossil fuel investments and our gun company. It's just, this is an important question to answer. It's a problem with the model as presented by Matt Bruenig, because the question on what they should invest in, to me, shouldn't be political. It should just be a diversified fund of assets. That's it, right? The most diversified fund of assets. That's all, right? I mean, just look at how any endowment is structured. That's how it should be structured, right? That's it. I don't, just allowing Treasury mandated asset allocation is what is, I don't know. I just think that's a very precarious way to structure your sovereign wealth fund. Again, we have to think Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis. A crazy person could be in charge of the Treasury one day that would be in charge of setting these mandates. And I wouldn't want to trust trillions, potentially tens of trillions of dollars of collective wealth to a potentially crazy, very politically motivated person, right? It's collectively owned wealth. It should be collectively determined, that wealth allocation, and it should be determined with good foundational rules and structures such that we don't end up basically squandering the wealth of all of our society. I mean, that would be very negative. So let's see. Sovereign wealth funds across the world have taken all sorts of approaches to asset allocation, and so it's difficult to say there is any settled approach. Well, I mean, I think the settled approach is a diversified asset allocation. I mean, you're going to diversify, you're going to invest in private equity, stocks, bonds, ETFs, mutual funds. I mean, you're just, again, it's going to be a broadly diversified portfolio, right? I think that's pretty much the settled approach. I'm not sure if there's any greatly different approach than that, certainly, but one possible approach is to asset allocation would be to initially invest in easy-to-manage listed securities like domestic and international equities and bonds. As the funds get bigger and the American Solidarity Fund Corporation becomes a more mature organization, it may make sense to broaden the American Solidarity Fund portfolio to include unlisted assets like private equity and real estate. Well, I mean, some real estate assets are listed, right? You've got, things like, REITs and sort of, publicly traded like real estate ETFs and stuff like that. So that's not necessarily true, but when thinking about asset allocation, it will be important for decision makers to consider how best to leverage the unique attributes of the American Solidarity Fund, its size, long-term horizon, and low need for liquidity. In addition to making general asset allocation decisions, the American Solidarity Fund could also make narrow allocation decisions that pertain to specific companies. For instance, the Treasury or U.S. Congress could create a process for excluding companies from the fund if these companies are found to violate established guidelines, such as engaging in human rights violations or environmental destruction. Norway's Global Pension Fund Global maintains an exclusion list along these lines. Well, right, but that's exactly right. Is that the Treasury in creating an exclusion list of companies, right? Again, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump potentially creating an exclusion list. Hey, we're not going to invest in fucking Starbucks equity because they're too woke. Forget about the potential benefits of diversification or something like that. We're not going to invest in Apple because they developed a diversity, equity, inclusion department. We're not going to invest in fucking, I don't know. We're not going to invest in Shell Corporation stock because they're investing in renewable energy, right? It's just, all of these things are problems that you're faced with when you have such a sort of politically ran sovereign wealth fund. And so I just, and to be fair, that goes for the other side too, right? I mean, for someone like AOC to be in charge, and she's going to say that, we're not going to invest in basically any of these companies because of that reason or this reason, despite, the diversification and influence that's associated with that equity ownership to actually change things potentially in that company. I mean, it's precarious to do it that way, right? You have to just keep in mind that even if people you like are in charge of this fund, we live in a democracy where in 4 to 8 years, you might have someone that's diametrically opposed to everything you believe in managing your wealth, right? This collectively fund, the collective wealth in this solidarity fund. So, number 3, ownership rights. Since the American Solidarity Fund will own shares of companies, it will have the ability to exercise the ownership rights that those shares confer, i.e. vote on shareholder matters like the election of the board and shareholder resolutions. There are 3 basic approaches to exercising ownership rights. Number 1, no voting. The first approach is to abstain from voting, i.e., to opt out of exercising ownership rights. This is the approach favored by Dean Baker. In this scenario, only the remaining private shareholders would vote on board members and shareholder resolutions. Number 2, representative voting, recommended by Matt Bruenig. The second approach is to make voting decisions through the country's government. What this means in practice is that the Treasury would issue voting guidelines that the American Solidarity Fund Corporation would have to implement on a vote-by-vote basis. For instance, the Treasury could create a CEO pay guidelines that the American Solidarity Fund Corporation must follow when casting shareholder votes for or against CEO pay packages. So again, this is an example where maybe a politically motivated manager of the American Solidarity Fund would be a good thing if the person running it has sort of left values. But again, what if Ron DeSantis issues, issues the guidance that says, you can't vote for anyone who believes in renewable energy or who believes in diversity and equity and inclusion, right? What happens when you give that power to someone who you diametrically oppose to, right? That's a question you should ask yourself when you're trying to design an institution. And I think that the way that Matt has designed this is maybe a little bit too politically vulnerable for my liking, I should say. Direct or proxy voting. The last approach is to allow the citizen owners to directly vote on shareholder matters through a website maintained by the American Solidarity Fund Corporation. This is the method favored by Lynn Stout and Sergio Gramito. Under this approach, citizen owners would be allowed to vote either directly on shareholder questions or give away their voting rights to a proxy organization that they trust to exercise them in their interest. Proxy organizations would register with the American Solidarity Fund so they could be selected on the website, and citizen owners would be permitted to change their preferred proxy organization at any time. For instance, a citizen owner who was interested in labor rights might give their votes to the AFL-CIO, while a citizen owner who was interested in the environment might give their votes to the Sierra Club. Frankly, I think that this is probably the best model in my view. I think that this is probably the model that I would favor personally, this direct or proxy voting for these sovereign wealth funds. In my view, the no voting option is a serious mistake. If the government does not vote its shares, then it is ceding total control of corporations to the most affluent people in society. It is fair to worry that the government might make bad shareholder votes from time to time, but not reasonable to think that the very affluent people will on average make better shareholder votes than a democratically elected government. Between the other two options, I have a slight preference for representative voting, at least initially. In the early years, the American Solidarity Fund and the American Solidarity Fund Corporation will need to focus its organization time on more important implementation challenges and will not own enough assets for their shareholder votes to make much of a difference anyways. Over time, it could make sense to add a direct or proxy voting system. Let's see. Taking a break. Blake Burns, number 1, give me absolute supreme unchecked power. Number 2, I will fix everything and then quietly retire Cincinnatus style, all problems solved. True, I agree. But yeah, seriously, I agree the voting system sounds like the best option. Well, there you go. All right, we agree on something. There you go. Universal Basic Dividend. The final aspect of the American Solidarity Fund is the easiest one, paying out the Universal Basic Dividend, the UBD, from the return on the fund. Alaska already provides a concrete model for how to do this, but I would recommend some cosmetic and substantive modifications to the Alaskan approach. American Solidarity Fund ownership shares. Every qualifying citizen should be given one non-transferable share of ownership in the American Solidarity Fund, which is what entitles them to receipt of the UBD, the Universal Basic Dividend. The Alaska Permanent Fund does not provide any kind of formal ownership shares, but the residents of the state nonetheless conceptualize themselves as joint owners of the fund. The idea of providing a quasi-formal ownership share was supported by the 1971 Danish trade union proposal, which would have provided each owner, quote, an annual certificate setting out their entitlement in the fund that, quote, could not be sold for at least 7 years, and even then could only be sold, quote, back to the fund itself. Unlike the Danish proposal, I'm recommending that the citizen owners never be permitted to sell their ownership share, and that the share remit back to the American Solidarity Fund upon its owner's death. As part of the ownership agreement, the American Solidarity Fund should have a website that looks like the sites run by Vanguard or Fidelity, where citizen owners can log on to see their single share of ownership, track its value over time, and so on. This is also where they would input their banking information and address to receive their dividend checks. The purpose of the website and the ownership share generally is to impress upon people that this is their collective wealth fund. This is partially a communications gimmick, but no more so than many of the hyper-abstract ownership gimmicks that already exist in countries' capital markets. I guess he gives an example of, the potential format of the American Solidarity Fund, I guess. So, The dividend amount. The dividend amount should be set equal to a 5-year moving average of a percentage of the American Solidarity Fund's market value. The percentage would be set legislatively or by the Treasury and would aim to, on average, withdraw an amount equal to the inflation-adjusted return of the fund. This is a hybrid of the way Norway's global pension fund Global and the Alaska Permanent Fund currently manages fund withdrawals. So, for example, the rule could be that 4% of the 5-year moving average of the American Solidarity Fund's market value will be withdrawn each year and used for the UBD, the Universal Basic Dividend. If the American Solidarity Fund's value over the last 5 years was 8 trillion, 9 trillion, 10 trillion, 11 trillion, and 12 trillion, then the dividend withdrawal would be 4% of $10 trillion or $400 billion. Using a specific percentage of a market value makes withdrawals administratively easy, and using a 5-year moving average of market values smooths out market volatility in asset prices, ensuring that the dividend amounts do not swing wildly year to year. Dividend eligibility. Alaska provides its dividends to every citizen of the state, including children. I would recommend excluding children from the American Solidarity Fund dividend. Well, that's interesting. I wonder why he would do that. Under this proposal, every citizen over the age of 17 would receive an ownership share and thus a dividend. Families with children should receive child allowances for each of the children they are caring for, but that should be done through a different program. Interesting. In an ideal construction, retired people would also be ineligible for a dividend. I wonder why that would be the case. As with children, retired people are owed a cash income, but they already receive such an income through Social Security's old age pension. Excluding children and the retired from ownership and dividends would allow the dividends to be higher by reducing the number of beneficiaries. Man, this is really interesting. This seems so against like the broad survey of what Matt Bruenig talks about. I mean, even in a lot of the instances in this very pamphlet, he talks about how, you get a $2,000 dividend and that's representative of $8,000 for a family of 4 or whatever it is. I just don't see why, I don't know. I don't see why you wouldn't just literally just make it universal. Population divided by $400 billion, and that's how much, money the adults in the household. I don't know. That seems like the best way to do it to me. Maybe there's more he'll talk about later on in the article. Maybe there's something I should talk to him about. That seems a bit weird. In practice, excluding the retired seems like it would be difficult to do. The retired are a large voting bloc, and many of them are dependent on private capital ownership for their retirement income. Since the American Solidarity Fund proposal intends to shift some of that capital ownership into a collective fund, they will need to be included in the American Solidarity Fund's ownership as well. Well, if they're included in the ownership, then why would they be excluded from the dividend? I don't understand why that would be the case. I don't know. I mean, I understand why children would be excluded from ownership because they're children, but when it comes to divvying out the dividends, I think it makes sense to give, a dividend to, the people who have children, an extra dividend to people who have children. I don't know. It seems like it would make the most sense to me, I guess. At the end of 2017, households and nonprofit, this is the conclusion, I should say. At the end of 2017, households and nonprofit organizations had a collective net worth of $98.7 trillion. By now, it is above $100 trillion. But this wealth and the income it generates is overwhelmingly owned by a small class of people that at the top of society. If we want to get serious about reducing wealth and income inequality, then we have to get serious about breaking up this extreme concentration of wealth. A dividend-paying social wealth fund provides a natural solution to this problem. It reduces wealth inequality by moving wealth out of the hands of the rich who currently own it and into a collective fund that everyone in the country owns an equal part of. It then reduces income inequality by redirecting capital income away from the affluent and parceling it out as a universal basic dividend that goes out to everyone in society, parentheses except for children and the elderly, I guess, in Matt's model. Social wealth funds have a long track record of success throughout the world, including in our own country on the state level, and I would also add, frankly, the local level as well. It is not a pie-in-the-sky idea, but rather a practical plan with dozens of working models currently in operation. There is an alternative to crushing inequality. The only question is whether we will choose to do it. Well, there it is, people. We went through it. The American Solidarity Fund. Mostly good, some bad, in my opinion. In general, a sovereign wealth fund for America is a good idea. I support it, and I do hope one day we get a cumulative sort of sovereign wealth fund in this country. Blakey Burns, there's a lot about this that I like. I agree. Old people won't vote for it. Then, well, yeah, that's maybe one of the problems with excluding the elderly. But in general, that was a pretty good rundown of a pretty interesting policy proposal, probably the biggest policy proposal that Matt Bruenig would advocate for, and I don't mind it. I think this is an interesting alternative to just a basic sort of sort of UBI and things like that. I think that this could, or at the very least, seriously supplement UBIs and whatnot. After all, if we had, I don't know, let's do some math on this as an example. So if we were to have $30 trillion in a sovereign wealth fund, 30,000 million. Fuck, I need to see the places. Okay, so this is 30. We had a $30 trillion fund. This is 3 trillion. $33 trillion fund, and we were to take, I don't know, this would be equal to this times, as Matt would recommend, I think he said 4%. Copy this formatting over. Oh shit. Copy this formatting over. There we go. What the hell? Hold on. Equals this times 0.04. That would mean that in this given year, we might have $1.2 trillion worth of wealth to divvy out. And if we were to divvy that out, divided by this current population of 330 million, 123, we would end up with about $3,600 per person per year, which would come to about $300 a month. If you only did adults and you excluded children, and you had some other sort of income supplement programs for people with children, 250, 123, we would end up with $4,800 per person per year, which is $400 a month that you would generate for people. And this could arguably be a conservative estimate, right? If we had a wealth fund similar size to Norway, it would be much bigger. I don't know, let's say 50 trillion. If you did a $50 trillion wealth fund, that would be $8,000 a year, right? So that's, what is that per month? Equals this divided by 12. That would be about $666 a month. The devil's number, perhaps tells you a little bit about this potential proposal that I get the devil's number as a calculation, but let's ignore that for now. The two paragraphs about the retired are contrasting an ideal version of his concept with the more practical implementation, which does include sending them money. It was worded a little awkwardly. Yeah, maybe. The last people you want to piss off are the AARP. They have infinite free time to write stern letters and all. Let's see. What if there were a universal private savings system, somewhat like superannuation in Australia, where the government made some direct contributions? Well, I mean, I think it would depend on how actively distributed that money is, right? So superannuation, as far as I'm aware, right, you're penalized for taking money out of it. You don't get income from it. That income is reinvested, right? But essentially, that's honestly, that's kind of what Matt Bruenig is describing here, where you can voluntarily contribute to a system and maybe the government matches it, but then it's just collectively managed, but you can go into your individual account and see what income it's generating for you on a monthly or an annual basis, right? I mean, to me, I would just advocate for like quarterly or monthly checks, just because it just makes sending out the income a little bit more logical and consistent for planning purposes. But like I said, I do have some problems with this proposal. I think it can be made better by adjusting, especially how money goes into the program as a divergence from how Matt views the money should go into the program. But in general, like I said, great, generically great idea, solidarity fund, whatever you call it, the sovereign wealth fund, American style, right? I think this is a good thing to be talking about. And I think that whether you're a socialist or not, I think that this is a good idea. I think that Alaska proves that, even very conservative red state people don't mind having, dividend checks and collective management of wealth and things like that, depending on the circumstances for how it's funded and how the money is distributed. So overall, interesting proposal. Overall, sovereign wealth funds, based and awesome. And I do hope that we get a sovereign wealth fund one day, hopefully with the right structures and the right sort of cash inflows to create and generate the revenue from the funds.